Alright, so my name's Adam. I'm a software engineer just down the block at HubSpot. As you can tell, I'm not from here. I'm just over for 6 months from Boston, heading back there at the end of June. But this is a talk about JSX that I gave last year that was 15 minutes long and is now 6 minutes long. Sorry, Pat. A couple of notes before I get started. First of all, I hate when people show code during a tech talk, but it's about a syntax extension, so I kind of have to do that. And all the code is publicly available. There's also a couple of examples that were not able to make it into this presentation because I had to cut it in thirds. But if you want to check any of that out, it's all online. So JSX, for those of you guys who don't know, is a syntax extension from Facebook that was developed for React. And what it allows you to do is co-locate something that looks like markup inside of your JavaScript components so you can create single file self-contained components. And it's a pretty cool way of building your apps. So the simplest React app is you bring in your React dependencies. You have a hello world component which returns a div with some text inside, and you can render that to a string. So it's pretty simple. But what's more interesting is what happens when this stuff all gets compiled. And so only two things change when you actually run this through Babel. The first is the original component, which changes to a call to react.createElement. 3 arguments. The first is the name of the component, the second is the props passed in, and the final one is the children. And of course, when you actually render it to a string, the same thing happens, but React intelligently knows that a capitalized component should be a function instead of a string. That's how you differentiate between HTML and your own custom components. And what happens when you actually run this, yay GIFs, is you'll get some markup back. So we get a div with hello world inside, and so that's really cool. But what makes JSX really special is that it's just a syntax extension, right? It has no relation to React. And so Babel actually gives you a hook where you can pass in any function you want, and you can do pretty much anything with JSX. So the most trivial example is you set that pragma to console.log at JSX console.log. We can put some, again, anything we want in there. I'm just using null because it's going to pass it as a string anyway. We can put in some props, and what happens when we call this function, what happens when you compile this, it just compiles down to some console.log calls. And you can see we have recursive access to the children, so that third argument there is another console.log call. We have the props that we gave it and the name of the component. And so using this simple pragma, we actually now have a really powerful way to visually describe our code, right? We can just access anything declaratively via a tree structure. And so what I did for the purposes of this talk is you can actually really easily do really cool things. For example, modeling a data schema. And so that's what this example is, and I'm not going to run through all the code, but it's actually only about 80 lines of code to do this entire tutorial. You have a schema class, which has a validate method, takes in an object, validates it against the schema that was passed in the constructor. The model, which is the function that we use in the pragma. If it's a schema, we create a new schema. Otherwise, we have a bunch of fancy logic to compile this down into a JavaScript object. And what that gets us is we can now visually describe a data schema. So you could take, say, SQL tables and describe them in a way that kind of looks like a Mongo format and something that you can very visually parse, which is really cool. In this example, I have everything typed, and for the purposes of this example, you see postal code is typed as a string. So when we create the schema, we have 2 examples, one with a string. You can't see that, but it's an int down there. And when we actually run this, you'll see that the first one validates as true, the second one validates as false. That was 80 lines of code, and we have a full data schema validator, which is really cool. And what this means is you can now actually extend this to do pretty much anything you want. So the reason that my knowledge about this actually came about was last year I had to build a form library and validate those forms on the back end. And instead of, some of you are nodding and you know where this is going, instead of building out the validator and the form separately, you can build out the form in JSX and then have some third-party library that knows how to render it on the front end and validate it against that same component on the back end. And so you could effectively cut your code in half just by using some pretty simple stuff with JSX. So I would invite you to play around with it a little bit, come and ask me if you have any questions after the talk, and check out the code online. Thanks, guys.